He's now research professor at, well, you can all see it, at Ghent University, and research professor of moral and philosophy and moral sciences. Dr. Schliesser.
Thank you, Tom. I wanted to be at this event not as a speaker, but just as an audience member, partly to just express my gratitude to the department, but especially to Jose for the splendid years I had here that really changed how I do philosophy. I'm not sure it's all for the better, but it really did change how I do philosophy. I think of whole of languages as a kind of, what's that term, the Benthamite panopticon? Where so if you're on top, you can see everything. And you look down, and if you're Jose Benardete, you can see any other faculty member that comes into the building, and then you can corner them in their office and talk to them. And with this roving Socratic eye, there's no escape for the junior faculty. So most of my first year here, I learned how to write very quickly, because the other parts of the day was me talking to Jose, ecstatically I have to say, about just about anything in philosophy. But his main message to me was that I was being unambitious in the way that I do history of philosophy. In fact, the model was that history of philosophy should just change philosophy. Wiggins Unlocked was one of the standard examples I would hear almost every week. And I've tried to take that to heart since. And this paper will in part reflect some of my thinking on that. But when I was invited for this talk, and then I'll get to the slides and start moving along. When I was invited to do this talk, to my amazement, with all the former colleagues, I was specifically asked to talk about Megalomania. Because Jose has a beautiful draft book, manuscript book, on Megalomania and Hobbes, Aristotle, and Hume. And as a specialist scholar on Hobbes, and especially Hume, I can attest and vouch for the fact that the book is brilliant and should be published. The book is a lot more than magnanimity in these characters. It's also about megalomania, but it's officially on magnanimity. And it hit me that if I wanted to talk about that book, I had to, like, as a good scholar that I am, I had to read other stuff by Benardete. Sort of explain where this book came from, how it fits in the oeuvre, and what's going on. And I should say there's another reason why I need to do that. The book is really addressed to Bernard Williams, because Bernard Williams says that certain thick evaluative concepts are not amenable to analysis, and this book is a kind of standard refutation of it. Problem is, I'm no Bernard Williams, so I couldn't, like, just as Bernard Williams start arguing back. That wouldn't work. So what I did instead is read everything that I could get my hands on in Santa Barbara by Jose. And what you're going to get is kind of a more synoptic vision of Jose, where the magnanimity book fits into a much larger pendulum, I guess. So this is a very bad pendulum. It's not isochronous. It doesn't keep time very well, in fact. And most of what I'm going to be talking about is going to be that upper corner there, unbridled passion, mania of greatness. Mania of greatness? Mania. That's where we're going to be when we're discussing Jose's oeuvre. Don't take it from me, take it from Jose. Ideally, you would do the voiceover here, Jose. So when we re-record this, you're going to be speaking like all the lines, and then I'm just mimicking you, okay? So we're very far as yet from having pulled out all the metaphysical stops. Can it be that there are no bounds at all to our metaphysical pretensions, no limits to our megalomania? Answer, no. And this is one of my favorite lines in the Infinity book, a sad high priest addressing Jose. You would have your actual infinite in the end, even as you had it in the beginning, only now in such an inflated form that it signifies sheer megalomania. Right? This is the register we're going to be in, and I'm going to take it seriously. Like all good jokes. So I started reading from the mid-50s onward, and this is what I more or less read to prepare this talk. The book on Adam Smith, again, will not be finished this year, thanks to this invite. Because I got sucked into it. There's some absolute, so all these, just look at the range of topics, right? Wallace Stevens, Macbeth, On Being or Nothing, Outness. We're all over the philosophic map. Now, what I'm going to claim is that despite the apparent disunity and different topics that are being addressed, there is in fact an underlying philosophic vision. And it's worth articulating this vision because in some ways it's surprising. Now, another thing you need to realize historically, and I'm speaking now briefly as a scholar, actually most of the talk will be scholarly, except that you can talk back. Most of the talks I give, the people are dead and there's nothing at stake. Somewhere in the mid-70s, Jose changed his philosophic register. And what I want to claim is that the vision remained the same, but the vocabulary in which it is expressed is different. That's sort of the underlying account that I'm going to give. Now, as a good scholar, and Jeff, correct me if I'm wrong about this, we also read reception. So this guy's Parsons, he's at Harvard now, together with Jeff, I guess. He reviewed Jose's book, and he's absolutely bewildered by the book. Some of this is rhetorical, right? So some of us say we shouldn't take this stuff seriously. But there is, in fact, a real categorization problem, and there's also very hard, for somebody writing in the mid-60s, it's actually very hard to get their head around what Jose is doing in the Infinity book. That's partly because the concept analytic metaphysician might be somewhere in a propositional space, but hadn't been invented yet. And people who are just not used to this kind of enterprise. I don't think, in fact, that the Infinity book was conceived as a contribution to analytic metaphysics. But that's a different story. We'll get to that in a second. So I want you to know what my methodology is for this paper, because it's very different from any other methodology I've used. And what I'm doing is I'm applying to Benardete what he applies to Wallace Stevens. Somebody that both Jose and I take extremely seriously. And so here's the crucial, for me, quote. It's not what I've written, but should like to have written, that constitutes my true poetic philosophy, bits and pieces of which are indeed scattered throughout the oeuvre. And my task today for you is to exhibit these scattered bits that both provide the unity to the corpus, and more accidentally, but excitingly, actually provides part of the secret historical background linking Wittgenstein to Kant, which is part of the story that Jose actualizes. A second important so the first quote does violence to the context. That's Jose interpreting Stevens, and I'm using that as a technique to interpret Jose. The second quote is autobiographical. As a professional philosopher, Jose writes, with my own concern for origins, to pursue an agenda featuring a Homeric Stevens quite compared to address Plato across the centuries. And what I want to end my talk with is that Jose actually has had a lifelong engagement on the quarrel between philosophy and poetry. And you won't get what he's up to, I think, if you don't take this passage seriously. So those are the methodological boundaries. So here are my theses. Jose's philosophy is a unified whole. We need to read the whole thing in light of each other, and maybe I'm the only one that will ever do that, but it needs to be done at least once, and hopefully it will inspire others to do it as well. His self-appointed task And I'm going to introduce a technical concept, because I use it, that's why it's technical, namely philosophic prophecy, to describe what Jose is up to, and I'm going to characterize that concept. And that what a philosophic prophet does in Bernardette's hands is to untain philosophy from self-imposed limits by way of conceptual introduction, articulation, and development. So today I'm very much not going to focus on the zillion of arguments that you can find in Jose's writings. On every page, more than 2. Infinitely many almost? I mean, a lot. And some of them are spectacular, and it's really exciting to see that Grand Priest has picked up on a few of them and is popularizing them in the literature. Now, the aim of this unshackling is to make philosophy wisely useful again, and I will make that clear at the end of this talk. And also, if, speaking of mania of greatness, Benardete ends the age-old quarrel between philosophy and poetry. His writings may well be the last word on this, if such a thing is possible. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm first going to introduce a part of Jose's work where I think he claims that the task of philosophy is to coin and articulate useful concepts. This, by the way, may say as much about Schliesser post-Benardete as it does about Jose, because that's what I think the task for the philosophic historian is. And it was only in reading Jose that he'd been indoctrinating me for all these long talks in my office in all the languages. The second thing I'll do is I'll talk about philosophic prophecy. I will characterize the concept as 9 features, and I will illuminate all these features, I hope, with bits and pieces of Jose's writings to show that both he instantiates the concept and actually is aware of it. So that's in it. He got there first. Well, Spinoza, Plato, one of them got there first. And in third, I'll conclude, and maybe I'll go over time, on the age-old quarrel. So the aims of philosophy. Philosophy, according to Jose in 1964 in the Infinity Book, is an investigation of utopian concepts that transcend the empirical. Now, it's worth realizing that utopian concepts, literally belong to no place, but it doesn't mean that they don't belong to this world. That's absolutely crucial. And I slide in there and its relation to the absolute. I'm going to unpack the absolute over the course of the next 40 minutes. If you know your history of philosophy, such concepts are like Spinozistic eternal truths. Something that Jose actually hints in various places throughout his career, maybe not always intentionally, but he actually invokes Spinoza along these lines at crucial places. Since we're at Syracuse, the house that Jonathan Bennett in part built, I'm not going to spend too much time on what eternal truths are, just read Jonathan's work. Now, what's crucial about this particular concept of philosophy is that it breaks with the authority of science. Right? And in the 60s, in the sort of afterlife of logical positivism or logical empiricism and the move toward naturalism, that's a very big deal. It doesn't mean that it's anti-scientific. Because on Jose's view, sometimes I call you Benardete, sometimes I call you Jose. I'm not sure which one is more appropriate at a test. Correct me if I'm going wrong. For Jose, ontology and metaphysics and natural science are important conversation partners, but it's a mistake for philosophy to make oneself beholden to the sciences in one way or another. And this is a theme that runs through Jose's writings, actually. I hope you read The Business about Hamlet there. Now, it's important to realize this is not a metaphysics of common life. It's not Strawson and the other Oxfordians. Yeah, that's it. I was hoping you would help me, John. Because Jose is quite explicit. He's no friend of common sense realism. Metaphysical rockets, all that. Right? It's not that project. And moreover, it's also not the project of an ideal language metaphysics that's been popular in more recent metaphysics. It's self-consciously a rescue operation. And what this rescue operation amounts to, I've already tried to hint at, is unshackling. But if you go to the back page of this, very old picture of Jose, there's this quote about, if I've succeeded in extending the limits, etc. That's the motto for this rescue operation. This quote is extremely well chosen, right? Okay, so the other part, the important part then is concept making. And that too, Jose has a view on. Philosophy can create a common ground between the life world of the Hyperboreans and our human life world. In context, the Hyperboreans are a thought experiment, and I'm going to reinterpret the context, so it's not that important. And it is precisely this common ground which performs the double role of transcending each particular life world and also providing a substratum internal to each life world. So, what does this amount to? First of all, Benardete presupposes a multiplicity of particular life worlds. And it is philosophy's task to create concepts that create common ground between life worlds. But the common ground should not efface the particular life worlds. On the contrary, the common ground solidifies each life world by providing a substrate. Right, so this is actually a ground task for the philosophical concept maker. And the common ground is provided by a framework that can be assented to, at least in principle, by all rational beings, while at the same time respecting the local life worlds. Now, in '64 at least, the mathematical science, or mathematics sans phrase, provides a good proxy for the ontology to be found in this common ground. To first approximation is even the content of this common ground. But crucially, Benardete denies that science can do the whole job of providing such common ground. And Jose offers two reservations. First, there is the existence of experience distinct from science. And here he actually echoes Schlick in a famous debate with Hempel, one of the few places where Jose and any of the people in Vienna are in common ground. Second, in each life world, concepts must be used for an end. Our whole approach presupposes a teleological account of concepts, and a fortiori a teleological account of man as the user of concepts. And appealing to Leibniz and Ryle, notice the pairing, science cannot provide our ends to us. Right? So this is where the utility starts to come in. So philosophy must create concepts that simultaneously do justice to the absolute, for as we repeatedly learn from Jose, looking to the absolute, philosophy must, like a Jedi master, and thus, too, create common ground between those from no place, the utopians or the hyperbarians, and folk. And moreover, these concepts have to be action guiding in our lives. So to be a good philosopher, you actually have to coin and articulate concepts that can be put to multiple uses, and at the same time capture something fundamental about the structure of possible reality. Okay, just a speculative interlude, and then I'll move to philosophic prophecy. In the Antichrist, Nietzsche also invoked the Hyperboreans. And Nietzsche is not the only one. It's also in Dante and all over the history of philosophy. And so it's quite possible that Jose is picking another Hyperborean. Conan the Barbarian fights Hyperboreans. I learned that while blogging. In the Antichrist, Nietzsche uses the Hyperboreans as a metaphor for the cold philosopher that rejects Christian pity and sympathy. That's actually about as easy an interpretation in Nietzsche as you get. So we could also read Benardete as suggesting that philosophy's task is to create concepts that create a common ground between the a-Christian Nietzschean philosopher and ordinary life without fusing them, and allowing each form of life to have its own action guiding principles. Now, what's really crucial explicit assumption, but I think I'm going to draw out of José's writings, is that José appears to be committed to the claim that social reality is determinable by way of conceptual articulation. I think that's actually right. And that's really to say that philosophers can be poetic world makers, right? And this prefigures the last part of the talk. Okay, so now let's get to philosophic prophecy. I'm going to characterize the concept as a kind of Weberian ideal type. Ken, are you still here? Keep me honest when I use Weber. By highlighting 9 features of this philosophic prophecy business. And I'm going to contrast it with family resemblance concepts like self-fulfilling prophecy, self-refuting predictions. This is where my philosophy of economics stuff comes in. Noble lies, Straussian esotericism, all of which have similar features to philosophic prophecy but are not identical to them. And I'm going to use José's writings to illustrate the concept because he practiced the genre of philosophic prophecy, and at a crucial moment in my characterization, he will actually use that same language. So I may be imposing the concept on it, but he imposes it on Leibniz and Hobbes and others, so it's fair game. Okay, so first, what is this thing not, but what does it look like? It's not a self-fulfilling prophecy. Right, self-fulfilling prophecies are kind of placebo effects on large-scale social phenomena. I'll give you a second to look at this, and then I'll go on. Hopefully you know what it is. It's also not a self-refuting prediction. And that's become very big in philosophy of economics right now. But it's clear, right, you have a set of utterances, and that has an impact on the world, and what follows from these utterances actually conforms to the template that is in the utterances, and either then undermines it or reinforces it. Right, that's the picture I want you to have in mind. Okay, so now I'm going to get to 9 characteristics of philosophic prophecy. The first thing to realize, and this is very bad history of philosophy, but it works today, it is kind of secular philosophy. So it's not biblical nor other religious prophets. It's prophecy by philosophers. I'm going to assume that it's uncontroversial what a philosopher is, right? Which, of course, is question betting in this context. Now, the content of philosophic prophecy may well be religious on some understanding of the word religious, or even theological in character. And I should remind you that at least in the first edition of the Infinity Book, we get a lot about old high priest of the Swahilis, who then goes on to express all kinds of theological claims. In some of the lesser well-known writings of José, we get a pro-Satan reading of Milton. That's also extremely theological in some sense. So this first characteristic is messy, won't do a lot of work in what follows, but I have to say. Here's where it really gets important. Philosophic prophecy is not primarily about offering predictions. Get that out of your head. Predictions are in some ways irrelevant. You can do prophecy by predictions, but that's a special case. What it really is about is creating concepts that will generate a possible future. That's what philosophic prophecy is really crucially about. And this, I think, José actually tells us regularly. Right? Our whole approach presupposes a teleological account of concepts, and a fortiori, a teleological account of man as the user of concepts. And I'm going to return to that claim. The second quote doesn't say exactly what I'm asserting, but it's important because this prospect of an infinite horizon is this business about the absolute that I want to get in, smuggle in. Now, the prophecy, the aim of José's prophecies is to break the spell of scientific philosophy, emanating out of Vienna and Cambridge and various places. It's not that he's against scientific philosophers, but they're only needed as friends. And the reason why he's against scientific philosophy is because he seems to think that it tames philosophy to focusing on manageable problems and puzzles. And that's not the Benardete approach. Now, just to give you a hint of the range of rescue projects that José has been involved in the 50-plus years he's been professionally a philosopher. The first first rescue project, and one I'm going to return to, is that philosophy and poetry need to be reconciled. We all know what Carnap is said to have said about poetry. We also know what Heidegger did with poetry and philosophy. We don't know, we know it by description in some way. And Jose thinks that both what Heidegger does and what Carnap does is a disaster. That's not a technical description. Contra Vienna and Cambridge, philosophy needs to be reopened to metaphysics. That's really something that's very clear throughout his writing. Understood as absolute, but this worldly. Moreover, contra Carnap, philosophy needs to recover practical wisdom, and I'm going to return to that when I discuss the poetry stuff. One thing I'm less sure about, so all these other things I actually think I can give you massive bit of evidence from the writing, is to what degree Jose also believes that there was damage done by the Analytic continental split, but he occasionally praises Brentano as like the solid ground that we've lost, not because he agrees with Brentano, but because Analytic and continental philosophy sort of start splitting from it. And contra Bernard Williams, thinking relative concepts can be subject to analysis. So all the prophecies, and there may be more, that Jose's involved in are part of these rescue projects. I told you, big mania, absolute. Okay, so philosophic prophecies are necessary, but not a sufficient condition for the prophesied future. Right? Not all prophecies are going to be successful. And Jose lived long enough to see that some of his own prophecies, which started out as quixotic, ended up being bread and butter. And really, if you take a historical approach to the Infinity Book, it is astounding how unlike its time it was, if you're thinking history of analytic philosophy, and how much it prefigures today in both analytic metaphysics, but also, which really surprised me, in philosophy of math in terms of looking at mathematical practice. So as much Hawthorne or Sider as Jody Azumi are anticipated in that book. You should read it cover to cover once, and not just for the arguments. Very instructive experience. So really, prophecies can happen. Sorry. Microsoft Word joke. Okay, so philosophic prophecy appeals to the imagination by way of narrative, history, travel reports, mythic history, poetry, or novel vocabulary. Think of anything you might throw into the Platonic category of mythos. And here prophecies contrasted to rational persuasion by way of whatever argument. Think of Platonic logos. This is quick and dirty, and again, probably not entirely fair to Jose. What's important, however, is that the content of philosophic prophecy is not irrational nor in opposition to reason. It reinforces it. One of my favorite lines in 1,000+ Jose Benardete pages is this one. Although oracular riches are contrary to nature, the poet may invoke them in the antecedent of the contrary fact to fact conditional, and thereby revealing the consequent what no mirror of life could reveal. I'm going to actually offer an analysis of this later, right? But this is the practice of philosophic prophecy right there. Not only, there's a lot more going on. In context, it's a beautiful comparison with Newton, which is why I get really excited. Okay, so if you think that good myth-making has no place in analytic philosophy, here's Lewis, more canonical we don't get, right? Discussing good myths and bad myths. Most of you know this stuff better than I do, so I'm not going to offer an extended interpretation, but Lewis recognizes, if you didn't notice already from reading the little dialogue holes, that myths has a positive place in analytic philosophy. And we can discuss that later. Okay, so philosophic prophecy often consists of claims that are beyond knowable at the time of articulation, but avoid obvious falsehoods, right? This is what distinguishes them from noble lies. Bernardette's metaphysical rocket is one such instance. You would have to know really quite a bit to try to, about very technical physics, to start undermining the metaphysical rocket, and it's not clear that you could succeed. One of my favorite little mini arguments, we actually had a discussion about this on Facebook not so long ago, is this one from José's earliest papers, a version of the cosmological argument. And the point is not whether the argument works or doesn't work. The work is that the conclusion of the argument is beyond knowable in some important sense. Can't falsify it. I think it's a spinozistic argument, but others in the room insist it has Leibnizian and Anselmian arguments. Okay, so there is an important sense in which philosophic prophecy is ultimately accepted on faith. They belong to the species of magisterial authority. They're not only accepted on faith because they combine with rational persuasion. But the spirit is always philanthropic, namely to offer useful instruction of mankind. And that is to refresh life. That's what guides philosophic prophecy, and is the spirit of philanthropic enterprise. Now, a really crucial criteria, or set of criteria to discern if you're dealing with an author that engages in philosophic prophecy, is that she nearly always will create a dialectic or rhetoric between true and false philosophers and true and false philosophic traditions. And she does this by, in fact, inventing these traditions. And José is a master at this. And not only that, is when I read the beginning of the Infinity book, it's like, oh my God, I learned philosophic prophecy from José without realizing. Because here's what he does it. The bad guys are Hobbes, Locke, and Kant, engaging prophetically in what follows. Right? His words, not mine. And the good guy, good guys are Leibniz and José. Right? With this very important double aspect, the ontological miasol approach. How you could mix Weyer and Leibniz like this is just terrific. Right? But this doubleness is the same doubleness that you find in the concept articulation that goes for the substratum and respects common life of different sorts. Right? So this runs through a lot of José's writings. So the nub of philosophic prophecy is that our present or even our future, once unforeseen actions, can be the intended outcome of past design. That's how prophecies work. So they're both contingent. The future is contingent on certain utterances, but that future can be the intent of those utterances, even though you don't know all the rich content that the future will have that instantiates those utterances. What's crucial, however, is this second bullet. Philosophic prophecy entails a shared horizon between the prophecy and the often implied prophecy future. This is this peculiar destiny of mind to open up onto the prospect of infinite horizon. Finally, and this is where often the hard analytic work is done, prophecy in practice works by introducing a set of conceptual oppositions in which problems are articulated and expressed, and the range of what counts as philosophy after successful prophecy and what sort of not philosophy often gets, a lot of the hard work is done there. So there's both boundary policing that follows from this, as well as what counts as interesting problems and not. Okay, just very quickly, what a philosophic prophecy is not. It's not the activity of offering noble lies. No, Plato and all that. Because these actually do engage in nobly false claims. That's a different, really different genre. Another thing it's not, and it took me a while to think this through, it's not about locating unstated esoteric doctrines in the text. Now, it's true that philosophic prophets, including José, can sometimes use esoteric techniques. José on Hume is really amazing because he shows how Hume offers you implications that are not stated, but when you put the text together, really seem unassailable. But in fact, in philosophic prophecy, it's the exoteric text what's doing the work and shaping the thought of future generations. So even though Jose is quite honest about his own Straussian background in the Infinity book, this is a very different genre. How much over time am I, Tom?
Well, you officially, you should be done soon.
Okay, well, I'll be done soonish. I've like 6, 7 slides. What's going to follow is schematic but not irrelevant. So, ever since Plato, we know that there's an old quarrel between philosophy and poetry. It's not often clear what the quarrel is, even in Plato. In fact, in Plato, there are probably 20 different quarrels. I just, a few days ago, read the Stanford Encyclopedia piece on it by Griswold, and a whole bunch of quarrels. But even then, it's already an old quarrel. So by now, it's very old. But you remember, right? Jose is interested in Stevens in part to address this quarrel. Now, that's that passage. I'm going to take the following 3 lines out of a longer poem of Stevens as capturing Jose's position. This is actually nowhere to be found, as far as I know, in Jose's writings, these lines, but I think they really capture how he's thinking about Stevens. And it's important to realize, just to be clear, Stevens is not being an idealist here or a subjective idealist. It's really about social reality, this. It's not about physics, although physics may also come in. So what follows is a reading of Stevens and Jose, such that indeed Jose can be understood as ending the quarrel. And that's really almost an argument. I really avoided trying to give arguments today, but here are the 5 important steps, most of which should be familiar by now. Science does not exhaust the whole of reality. In fact, poetry is needed to make the gaps of science visible, number 1, but poetry may also be the cause of these gaps. And I'm going to try to give some flesh to both these claims. Poets can be philosophers. Stevens very clearly is going to count as one. But also, poetry is required for philosophy if philosophy is to be action-guiding, namely wise. Of course, it takes philosophers to discern in the poets when they're wise. Moreover, philosophers can be poets, and metaphysics is poetics, and therefore, to use Jose's technical terminology, back in the game. If these 5 claims are true, it follows that philosophy can be wise, probably even without fusion with poetry, but in fact, when fused with poetry, definitely. And if so, then indeed Jose has answered by eliminating, in some ways, the quarrel. Has answered Plato by eliminating the quarrel. So I'm going to go do that, and then I'll shut up. So, I quoted this last sentence, but the whole passage is just terrific. Newton's first law of motion describes how every body would act if it were free of all impressed forces. Owing to universal gravitation, there is and can be no such body. Revealing the nature of every body as it would be found in trials to which it cannot be exposed. Jose is here actually quoting Johnson on Shakespeare, I think. Newton's first law is to be seen as true, contrary to fact, conditional in the subjunctive mood. No mere mirror of life, it is in his subjunctive, not indicative mood, that the poet can emulate the physicist. Although oracular virtues are contrary to nature, the poet may invoke them in the antecedent of a contrary to fact, conditional, and thereby reveal the consequent what no mirror of life could reveal. Right, so I think an enormous amount is going on in this passage, some of which well above my metaphysical pay grade. But I think one of the claims that is definitely present here is that poetic worlds can reveal otherwise invisible reality. That's crucial. Right, so, and what it reveals, and I think in context this is reasonably clear, it makes visible our intentional objects. That's the Quinianism in a weird way in Jose. But also, in virtue of the productions of the imagination and people's subsequent beliefs, philosophic poets or philosophic prophets can create new social realities in ways that science really can't capture. That's the position. Okay, moreover, poets are metaphysicians, and this Jose asserts regularly in his writings. I'll give you two choice quotes to see he's not stuck on Stevens, but also on Homer. The vindication of poetry itself, this is his commentary on this, lies in its capacity to challenge the very limits of meaning and intelligibility. And this is Jose commenting on Milton's Satan, etc. So poetry isn't just form of metaphysics, but it helps break down barriers towards the absolute. That's what this limits of meaning and intelligibility are about. Moreover, poetry can help undermine the philosopher's self-limitation. Sata vacha, because I don't think Jose likes me saying this, tropological analysis is a rejection of Heideggerian poetry. He meets on his own grounds Heidegger. What tropological analysis I haven't told you yet. You should read Jose's papers for that. Okay. Almost done. The analytical philosopher, in his eagerness to travel light, has been prone to regard wisdom as just another piece of excess baggage, impeding the progress of traditional philosophy that is long since dumped by the wayside. Having jettisoned all claims to wisdom, and quite ungrudgingly, with good riddance too, the analytical philosopher is quite prepared to certify those of the poet, not least because he can only slightly add, if it is in the pages of the poet that wisdom is to be found, it takes a philosopher to find it. Right? So once philosophy became a progressive enterprise, i.e. properly scientific philosophy, it had no space for wisdom. This, in a different register, I call Newton's challenge to philosophy, but that's Schliesser, not Jose. Even so, poetry is still a source of wisdom. And quite elegantly, Jose points out that this is in fact Quine's own view. And if you go into Theories and Things, Quine is explicit about it. But of course, the philosophers needed to unearth the wisdom. And Jose's own practice is a constant mining of the poets for their wisdom. This is quoting from the Magnanimity book. Of course, it's important that philosophers can be poets too. And here I'm just going to argue from authority. You've got an A team, philosophers. You've got a B team, poets. Right? If Jose says it, it's true. In the manuscript, there's a lot of argument for that claim. But in the interest of time, I skip over. Last two slides, Tom. The poet is not the only one who stands to gain. The philosopher stands to gain still more from this association. I dare not say fusion, although he's just argued for fusion. This is from the piece on love and why metaphysicians make the best lovers, much beloved by Jose's students, who called my attention to it. Appealing to the vanity of the metaphysicians, prostituting almost, but fair enough. Particularly at a time when it has come to be felt that the philosopher is no longer entitled to take credit for being wise as well as clever. That's from Rorty, Jose from Rorty. In fact, any suggestion that wise might be predicated as researchers leaves the analytical philosopher feeling distinctly uneasy, though he has come to feel altogether at home with metaphysics, and it is not to be doubted that the words metaphysics and wisdom gravitate to one another. Right? Jose's therapeutic job is to make the analytic philosopher feel less uncomfortable with wisdom. I close with an immodest conclusion. Jose's immodest. The source of the unease can be traced back to Aristotle himself. At the point where he even defines metaphysics by identifying it with wisdom, finds himself obliged to qualify his identity thesis. There is practical as well as theoretical wisdom, and metaphysicians can be identified only with the latter. It is thus to be surmised that wisdom sans face, French is bad, can be predicated only where at least some practical guidance, right, the theological life-affirming stuff, as to the conduct of life is forthcoming. Thanks to my having shown, this is Jose, in effect, how and why is that the metaphysicians make the best lovers, even the most technical studies in abstract ontology can now be recognized as never ceasing to hover in the neighborhood of wisdom. There's a little extra line added to it. if you want to understand the politics of this, and it's not always pretty politics, we have to go to the Republic. I end. All questions can be directed at Jose, obviously.
We'll take a break for 3 or 4 minutes.